I'm David Barrie, the author of Incredible Journeys, Exploring the Wonders of Animal Navigation. This is a book I wrote about how animals find their way around, including human beings. I'm a navigator myself. I started sailing at a very early age, and I was lucky enough to be introduced to the art of celestial navigation when I was 19 years old, sailing across the Atlantic in a small yacht. And I was blown away by the fact that it was possible to determine my position in the middle of the open ocean by reference to the height of the sun and the stars above the horizon. And it's all thanks to the work of generations of astronomers, mathematicians, and instrument makers. Though, of course, we now have GPS, which puts celestial navigation in the shade. But I realized in writing my book Sextant, which is all about how the sextant altered the course of history and made possible the achievements of the early scientific explorers like Cook and Bougainville and Vancouver and the rest of them. I realized then that, of course, all animals with the power of movement, even very small ones, actually need to be able to navigate. We're not the only navigators on this planet. In fact, some of the most impressive navigators are tiny creatures like insects. And I was first exposed to this as a student of experimental psychology a long time ago when I learned about the extraordinary work of Carl von Frisch, the great Austrian behavioral scientist who studied the honeybee and its ability to communicate information about the sources of nectar to its fellow bees by means of an extraordinary dance. But less well known is the work of a scientist called Rüdiger Wehner, whom I interviewed for the book, who has spent literally 50 years exploring how another insect, the desert ant of North Africa, navigates. Wehner has revealed that the desert ant, a small creature with a tiny brain, a fraction of the size of our own. I mean, it has about 400,000 neurons in its brain, and we have maybe 85 billion neurons in ours. Nevertheless, this tiny creature can do things that we can't do without the help of instruments. For example, the desert ant is capable of what we call dead reckoning. It can run out over the featureless salt pans around its tiny nest entrance, which is merely a hole in the ground. It can run around, zigzagging around for hundreds of meters. It then may find a dead insect, and astonishingly, it can then head straight back to the entrance of its nest. This was a puzzle for a very long time, until Wehner discovered that what these small insects are doing is using the polarized light of the sun to steer by. And more than that, they can even make an allowance for the gradual movement across the sky of the sun during the course of the day. It's changing azimuth, to use the technical term. In addition, the desert ant has a built-in odometer. In effect, it counts its steps to work out exactly how far it's gone. And by integrating the information about how far it's gone with the various course changes, it can plot a course straight back to where it came from. That's not all there is to desert ant navigation, but you'll have to read the book to find out more about it. It really is an astonishing story. Other insects too have produced amazing feats for us to wonder at. For example, the nocturnal dung beetle of southern Africa. Now, Eric Warrant, an Australian scientist, and his colleague Marie Dacker, who both work at the University of Lund. I interviewed them and learned about their work with these astonishing creatures. Well, dung beetles may not be quite as impressive navigationally as the desert ant, but they do something very interesting. They gather around piles of dung at night. They take chunks of dung and roll them into little spheres and roll those spheres away from the dung pile as quickly as they possibly can. They need to do that because it's a very competitive business being a dung beetle. And other dung beetles will mug beetles with ready-made balls of dung and take them away from them. So the dung beetles that have made a ball of dung have to get away as quickly as they can, and that means, crucially, that they need to go in a straight line. They don't want to find themselves doubling back to where they'd started from. Well, that may not sound like a very difficult task, but it is quite challenging in complete darkness, especially if, like a dung beetle, you're rolling a ball backwards in your hind legs, often over quite rough terrain. Well, Eric Warrant and Marie Dacker did some experiments, and they discovered that one of the things that the dung beetles were doing was making use not of the light of the sun like the desert ant. How could they during the night? Instead, they were making use of the polarized light of the moon to maintain a steady course. Well, that was remarkable enough, but then a few years later, they made an even more extraordinary discovery when they saw dung beetles rolling their balls in complete darkness, it seemed, before the moon had risen. And they wondered how that was possible. And they looked up at the beautifully unpolluted night sky on the edge of the Kalahari Desert, and they could see the brilliant ribbon of the Milky Way. And they looked at each other and they said, is it possible that the dung beetles are actually using the Milky Way as a kind of compass? Well, to cut a long story short, the answer is yes. They did some wonderful experiments that involved putting little cardboard hats over the beetles' eyes to prevent them seeing the Milky Way, and they went all over the place. And then they put them in a planetarium and moved the Milky Way around, and sure enough, they were able to show that the Milky Way was a crucial factor in dung beetle navigation. Eric Warrant has also done work with his colleagues on a migratory moth in Australia called the bogong moth, which goes every year for more than 1,000 kilometres from Queensland down to the snowy mountains in New South Wales to spend the summer months in cool caves up on the mountain tops. It then returns to Queensland at the end of summer when it gets cool again. So how does the bogong moth find its way? Well, I joined Eric and his team on a memorable expedition to the snowy mountains while I was working on the book, and we had some great times up in the middle of the night, high in the mountains, with these astonishing starry skies above us, with no light pollution, of course. And we did these experiments, and it turns out that the bogong moth is a magnetic navigator. It has a magnetic compass sense which enables it to set and maintain a course. And more recently they've discovered that, like the dung beetle, the bogong moth can also use the Milky Way as well as landmarks, because it has very, very good night vision. So there's another extraordinary insect navigator. But you're probably wondering, if we're talking about animal navigation, why haven't I mentioned birds? Because of course they are probably the most famous and prodigious navigators of all. Think of the Arctic terns, which fly literally from one end of the world to the other and back every year. Recent tracking experiments have shown that Arctic terns can travel the best part of 100,000 kilometers in a single year. And the bar-tailed godwits that breed in Alaska fly right across the entire Pacific, 11,000 kilometers to New Zealand. And they do that without stopping. It's an astonishing feat. Well, a huge amount of work has been done on bird navigation over the last 100 years or so. And it turns out that birds, of course, have quite a variety of tools at their disposal. One of the most important is a star compass. Nocturnal migratory birds have a way of using the stars to work out where due north is. They also, some birds, have access to a sun compass, a time-compensated sun compass again, rather like the desert ant. They can maintain a steady course by reference to the position of the sun, even though it's moving across the sky during the day. Many birds also seem to have a magnetic compass sense, though exactly how this works is one of the great mysteries on which a huge amount of work is currently going on. And there are also other interesting clues. It looks as if some birds make very good use of their sense of smell. There is a strong train of evidence that homing pigeons make use of their sense of smell to find their way home, even when they've been displaced maybe 200 or 300 kilometers and taken to a place they've never ever visited before. Another theory is that they may be making use of very, very low frequency sounds, infrasound. The jury is still out on some of these things, but there's a lot of fascinating research going on. And birds, though a lot is understood, birds still remain quite mysterious. Turning to a completely different kind of animal, let's look at reptiles, and in particular marine turtles. Now, marine turtles are famous for their ability to return to their native beach, the place where they were hatched from the egg, to lay their own eggs in the case of females. And during the interval, they may travel right round an entire ocean basin. So how do they navigate round an ocean basin and find their way back to those beaches? Well, another scientist whom I interviewed, Ken Lohman, has spent 30 or more years studying that, and he's come up with some amazing results which indicate that some turtles certainly make use of the Earth's magnetic field to track their position and to set an appropriate course to find their way back home. Again, you'll have to read the book to find out more about it, but it also looks as if they may well be able to locate the beaches where they were born by the magnetic characteristics of those beaches. Probably other factors like smell are involved as well, but that remains to be clarified. Now, I don't want to give the impression that all the mysteries of animal navigation have been solved. That is very, very far from the truth. How do the great whales, like humpback whales, navigate across thousands of miles of open ocean? Something they can do with great precision. They've been shown to migrate from the waters around Antarctica to the breeding grounds in the waters of the tropics, going in an almost straight line to particular groups of islands where they rear their young. Well, nobody actually knows how they do this. It's a profound mystery, and of course it's difficult to do experiments on whales. So we can only speculate, but it may be that they too use the Earth's magnetic field. It may be that they use their sonar in some way. But I hope if you get to reading this book, you will share my sense of astonishment at the abilities that our fellow creatures display. And one of the reasons I wrote the book actually was to remind people that we are surrounded by natural wonders that in many cases are under grave threat as a result of the actions that we humans are taking. And I think it's also important for us to reflect on what we're doing to ourselves, because since GPS arrived on the scene just 20 or so years ago, we have become more and more heavily reliant on these electronic gadgets to enable us to find our way around. And of course GPS is a technological wonder. But I do worry, and I'm not the only one, that as we become more and more dependent on these gadgets and turn our backs on the traditional tools of navigation that our ancestors relied on, the ability to look to the stars, to the sun, to learn routes by memorizing landmarks and so forth. As we do that, we are not only cutting ourselves off more and more from the natural world, which is a great source of nourishment for our souls, but we're also endangering our own ability to navigate by natural means. Anyway, I hope you'll buy my book and enjoy reading it, and if you do, by all means tell me and look me up, davidbarrieauthor.org. Thanks so much for listening. Goodbye.